Hey guys, welcome on in for today's video where I'm going to be making my final predictions on what I think is going to happen in the 2020 Democratic Iowa caucus. And if you're new to the channel, welcome. Consider subscribing throughout the entire primary season. I'm going to be making these final prediction videos and giving my take as to who I think is either going to get first, second, or third in each respective race. And then beyond that, after the fact, I'm going to be keeping track of how many pledge delegates each of these candidates are getting throughout this process and how close they're getting to the 1,990 pledge delegates needed to win on the first ballot at the Democratic Convention. I'm going to continue to make these updated results videos after the fact. And then also after the fact, I'm going to be making recap videos going over where I went right and where I went wrong with my predictions in these different races throughout the process. So it's going to be a really fun time for the channel over this next handful of months, making the predictions, going over the results, and continuing to go through the polling data as we get it out throughout the entire primary season. So I'm really looking forward to all of that. So starting off here, the first state, the Iowa caucuses, they're being held tomorrow evening. It's not easy to participate in a caucus in comparison to just a traditional primary. It takes a lot more time and effort. And as a result, the candidates that tend to have the more committed supporters, the people that are more politically active, tend to do a little bit better in caucuses. Now, that's not necessarily quite as much the case in Iowa, given how it is entrenched into their politics. You actually get quite a large turnout in an Iowa caucus in comparison to the percentage of the entire population of the state, as opposed to other states that have caucuses that aren't as necessarily politically active or important as Iowa, given that they are the first result. But also, the Democratic Party has made an initiative where they've gone out and given their recommendations to states to consider switching over to primary. So we actually don't have as many caucuses in 2020 as what we had back in 2016. But there are still a handful of caucuses to be had. And of course, the first one is going to be Iowa. Then we move over to the primary in New Hampshire. And then we have another caucus in Nevada. Now, starting off here with Iowa, I'm going to make my prediction for the top three, but I want to start with just outside of the top three where I'm at. So in fifth place, I think it is going to be the Minnesota Senator Amy Klobuchar. Now, she could actually surprise in this process in Iowa. It is the neighboring state to Minnesota. This is the type of electorate that you would think Amy Klobuchar could have success with. And if Klobuchar isn't doing well right out of the gate in a state like Iowa, then it would not be a great sign for her campaign. She got the endorsement from the New York Times not all that long ago. And since that point in time, she hasn't necessarily moved very much in terms of her national numbers. Really hasn't been much of a noticeable difference. However, after that endorsement in the New York Times, we have seen her take a little bit of a step forward in some of these early areas like Iowa and to a little bit lesser of an extent, New Hampshire. But it's pretty much all on the line here for Klobuchar in Iowa. If she doesn't surprise and have a really strong result, then she's probably going to be bowing out of the race at some point thereafter. But I think she's a little bit too late in terms of making this run up into the Iowa caucuses. Throughout primary season, she's been very low in the polls. She's been able to survive and at least stay in this race as opposed to other senators that have stepped out, like Cory Booker, for instance, Gillibrand, Kamala Harris, some of these other establishment Democrats, where Klobuchar has been sticking it out, where a lot of those other more establishment type Democrats have stepped out since they haven't been having success. Klobuchar, she has shown something in the way of gaining support in Iowa, moving her way up in the polls, but still in general, kind of outside of that top upper tier. Anything can happen in these caucuses, but I'm still feeling like it's going to be Klobuchar finishing in fifth place. And if she's not reaching the 15 percentage point threshold at these different caucuses, then her voters for their second choice, I think, would most likely go to Joe Biden and maybe to a little bit lesser of an extent, somebody like a Pete Buttigieg. So that could possibly be a benefit for the centrists that are likely to compete a little bit higher than maybe where Klobuchar is at. But based on what the polls have been saying very recently, it actually wouldn't be a complete surprise to see Amy Klobuchar finish past somebody maybe like a Pete Buttigieg, who was showing a lot of strength in Iowa just a couple of months ago. But since that point in time, he has taken some steps back. We'll see how Pete is able to finish in the state as we actually head into the caucuses. So then in fourth place, and fourth through first, I had a really hard time nailing down exactly where I felt all these candidates were going to be going. In fourth place, I have Elizabeth Warren. Now, before Pete Buttigieg saw his rise in Iowa, kind of in the November, December range. Before that, it was Elizabeth Warren, where she had some very strong polls in Iowa kind of through September and October before she took her steps back. Elizabeth Warren, it just doesn't feel like it's happening for her right now. Over the closing months, that progressive vote seems like more or less it has coalesced behind Bernie Sanders, where he is surging going into primary season in terms of what the polls have been saying, whereas Elizabeth Warren has been taking steps back. And she's kind of in the polls been hovering right around that 15 percentage point threshold. Actually, in terms of the average of the Iowa polls right now, she's actually at 14.6%, which is just below that 15%. So if she has a lot of these caucuses where she's getting a decent amount of support, but not to that 15 percentage point threshold number, the second choice of her voters, I think, are overwhelmingly going to be going over towards somebody like a Bernie Sanders. That could be a big get for the Vermont senator if somebody who has a decent amount of support isn't able to reach that threshold, and then their voters potentially going over to one of the other progressives in the race, somebody like a Sanders who might have a little bit more in the way of success. So now second and third place, I struggled with, but at this point, I think it is going to be Mayor Pete Buttigieg finishing in a disappointing third place for his campaign. They've put a lot of work and effort and resources into trying to surprise in the first state of Iowa and then the next state of New Hampshire, because consistently throughout this process, he has been polling a decent margin behind the upper tier candidates nationally, but his campaign, they've been smart about it. They feel like Mayor Pete has an opportunity to potentially connect with the types of voters that you're going to be getting in Iowa and New Hampshire. Of course, Iowa is relatively close to the city of South Bend, where Mayor Pete is the mayor of course, and an electorate there in Iowa that could possibly be very beneficial to Pete Buttigieg. So they put in a ton of resources, and their campaign is really on the line in Iowa and New Hampshire, where if Pete Buttigieg doesn't surprise and do very well and competitive at the top, then he's also somebody that might not last extremely long throughout this process in terms of just the resources needed to compete long term. If you're putting a lot of resources into these first states and you're not getting that boost that you need in terms of the national numbers. So in terms of that national picture right now, actually Bloomberg has surpassed Pete Buttigieg and is getting really close and competitive with Elizabeth Warren. So Buttigieg's kind of taken a little bit of a step back over the past couple of months after he really had his surge mainly in the month of November. I was really skeptical with Buttigieg at the time, especially with those Iowa polls that we were seeing. We saw that Buttigieg was in first place, but he had very low commitment of his supporters, where they were kind of more in that basket of, well, we maybe be leaning towards Pete Buttigieg right now, but we haven't officially made up our mind. It's important when you look at the polls, not just to see who's in first, second, third, fourth, etc., but also the committed support that the individuals are getting from their base, because that means they're likely to have a higher floor and potentially a ceiling from that point in time that can build off of that very strong commitment of support that somebody like Pete Buttigieg hasn't really had. And then also Warren, who I said was going to finish probably around that fourth place area, she also doesn't have quite the level of committed support that we're seeing from some of these other upper tier candidates. But I'm putting Mayor Pete Buttigieg there in third place. But I wouldn't be surprised if it was somebody like Elizabeth Warren or even an Amy Klobuchar that was able to work their way up into that third place position, and Pete maybe even to take another step back from where we have been seeing him in these Iowa polls more recently. So then in second place, I think it is going to be the former Vice President, Joe Biden. And I'm not totally confident about this one. I wouldn't be surprised if it was somebody like a Mayor Pete or even Elizabeth Warren who was able to leapfrog over Biden and maybe having him finish in third, fourth place, kind of in that range. But at the end of the day, what I think is going to happen with Joe Biden is the Democrats in the state of Iowa who identify more as moderates or centrists, I think they're more likely to coalesce behind somebody like a Joe Biden than a Pete Buttigieg or an Amy Klobuchar, because they feel like Biden has a much better chance of competing in this race. On a national level, he's still in the lead in terms of the average of the national poll and just possibly viewed as more of a viable candidate than some of these other options. And the centrists and moderates who don't want somebody like a Sanders or a Warren to succeed, perhaps they coalesce their vote behind Joe Biden, who's viewed as the centrist or moderate in the race right now that has the best chance to go on and win this thing. Of course, with Bloomberg not being a factor in this process either, that centrist moderate vote isn't going to be siphoned off by somebody like a Bloomberg, and that can possibly help Biden as well to perform a bit better. It's going to be very interesting to see this dynamic and how it plays out, because with these polls, what we've been seeing, it's been a very close race at the top. Anything can happen in a caucus, but I see Joe Biden finishing there in second place in Iowa. And then in first place, it almost seems like a foregone conclusion at this point in time that it's going to be Bernie Sanders in terms of all of the positive news that has come out for him in his campaign, particularly not just closing the gap in terms of the national polls, but also doing really well in both Iowa and New Hampshire with the polls that we've been receiving over the past few weeks. Bernie Sanders, he's surging right at the moment that you want to be surging as a campaign over the past month, heading right into primary season. And the fact that Iowa is a caucus should benefit the Vermont senator. In 2016, he consistently outperformed what the polls were saying in caucus states. He has the most committed supporters, very politically active individuals. He has an insanely strong ground game in Iowa. He is fundraising very well, which allows him to get his message out there and a larger megaphone as a result with all that grassroots donations, individual contributors to his campaign. And Sanders, it's a big contrast between 2020 and what was happening back in 2016, because Bernie Sanders, he didn't even really want to run in 2016. He just wanted to have a contrast of ideas in the Democratic presidential primary against Hillary Clinton. So he kind of had a skeleton crew of a campaign throughout a good portion of primary season, not taking it quite as seriously as what the Sanders campaign is doing in 2020, where they're a very well-oiled machine, totally different dynamic. And in 2016, he essentially tied Hillary Clinton in Iowa, and that was with much less name recognition and much less favorables. People didn't know who he was, and a worse ground game and a campaign that wasn't even close to the level that it is here in 2020. So those are all things that can benefit Sanders going into Iowa in 2020, as opposed to where he was in 2016, where he surprised a lot of people in essentially getting that 50-50 tie in the Iowa caucuses with former Secretary Hillary Clinton. And then also other things that could be beneficial towards Bernie Sanders is if candidates that aren't getting to that viability 15 percentage point threshold, such as a Tulsi Gabbard, an Andrew Yang, and possibly an Elizabeth Warren, those are all second choice options that could possibly be going over more so to somebody like a Sanders than some of these other options that might be getting above that 15 percentage point threshold. So the Iowa caucuses, it's a really fun time. It's really hard to predict exactly what's going to happen. The polling can sometimes be all over the place. If we look back to 2016, the Democratic side of the polling in the caucus was actually relatively fair. Sanders outperformed a little bit. Hillary Clinton was kind of more around where you expected her to be. But on the Republican side, it actually showed Donald Trump in the average of the polls quite ahead of Ted Cruz. But then in the Iowa caucuses, it actually ended up being Ted Cruz that went on to defeat Donald Trump. So the polling was a bit off in that instance. It takes a lot of time and effort to go out and participate in these caucuses. You have to be really committed to your candidate, and that can certainly benefit somebody like a Bernie Sanders and why he did so well in so many caucuses in 2016. I think that starts off here in Iowa in 2020. So those are my predictions on who I think is going to get first, second, and third. I did a little bit more of a prediction in terms of fourth and fifth place with Warren and Klobuchar respectively. But as we continue to work our way through this process, this field is going to get whittled down more and more. So I felt like just in terms of predicting the top three in each state was going to be the best way to go, because even though there's so many individuals competing at this point in the process, that's not going to be the case as we work our way even through the later on portions of these early states and then into the month of March, where we have the most pledged delegates up for grabs through that particular month. It's going to be a really fun process and time, and I rambled on way more than I thought I was going to in this video. I appreciate anyone who's been able to make it to this point in my ramblings, but this is just getting started. This is the first state of Iowa. Next week, I'm going to have my New Hampshire predictions, then the Nevada prediction after that, then South Carolina, and then on Super Tuesday, I'm going to make one prediction video where I go through all 16 states, so that's probably going to be quite a bit longer as well than this particular video, just going over one result. And I can't wait to go through and recap my predictions and see where I went right and where I went wrong in these instances, and keeping track of what percentage correct I am throughout this process. It's going to be a really fun time, so consider subscribing if you haven't already done that, and I hope to see you guys back here for my next video.